The phone rang at 9:47 on a Tuesday night, and 3 words into that call, my hands were already shaking. "Is your husband home right now?" That was my Uncle Reginald's voice, but it didn't sound like him. Flat, careful. Like a man stepping onto ice he wasn't sure would hold. "Yes," I said, glancing toward the ceiling, toward the sound of the television upstairs. "He's up watching the game. Why?" Silence stretched on the line longer than it should have. Brenda. My name landed heavy in his mouth. That can't be true. My name is Brenda Whitfield. I'm 46 years old, a registered nurse for over 20 years. And until that Tuesday night, I believed I understood the shape of my own marriage, even the parts of it that had gone quiet and cold these last 2 years. "What are you talking about, Reggie?" "I'm standing on the dock right now," he said. "I own this cruise line, Brenda. I check every manifest myself. Charles boarded my ship 4 hours ago. Your sister was on his arm." The television upstairs kept playing. I could hear the faint murmur of a commentator calling a play. I'd carried Charles a plate just after 6, set it outside the partly closed bedroom door, the way I'd done more than once lately when he said he wanted to watch the game alone. A quiet "thanks" had come from inside, and I'd gone back downstairs without thinking twice about it. Since then, the television had never stopped. "That's not possible," I said, but my voice had already started to lose its footing. "I watched him walk up that ramp with my own eyes," Reginald said. I called his name. He didn't turn around fast enough before I saw Diane's hand on his back. I didn't answer right away. I was doing math in my head, the kind of math a woman does when she's adding up small things she'd ignored on purpose. The new cologne. The phone turned face down on the counter. The trip Diane mentioned 2 weeks ago, vague about dates, vaguer about company. "Are you sure it was him?" I said, not as a question, because I already wasn't asking one. I was stalling. "Brenda, I've known Charles 12 years, I'm sure." Something in my chest went from confused to furious in the space of one breath. Not loud, not yet. Just a low burn settling into my spine, the kind that doesn't shout. It waits. Before I could find the next thing to say, before I could even decide whether to scream or go quiet, I heard footsteps on the stairs behind me. Slow, deliberate, not the rhythm Charles walks with. I turned toward the sound with the phone still pressed to my ear, Reginald's voice now small and far away. "If you're watching this right now, I want you to drop in the comments what time it is for you. Because where this story goes next, you're going to want to remember exactly where you were sitting when you heard it." The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs. Not Charles's gait. Not Charles's weight on the wood. Only then did it hit me. I had never actually seen him upstairs. I'd heard a voice through a mostly closed door. I'd left a plate outside. I'd listened to a television that had kept playing for hours. Every piece of it suddenly felt less like proof, and more like something carefully arranged for me to believe. I lowered the phone slowly from my ear, my heart hammering against my ribs like it already knew something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. The front door, the one I was standing 3 feet from, the one I'd locked myself not 20 minutes earlier, creaked open behind me. The door swung wide before I could step back. And a man I'd never let into my home filled the frame, a gun raised level with my chest. I didn't scream. My body just stopped, every muscle locking at once, the phone still loose in my hand with Reginald's voice tinny and far away, calling my name into the air between us. "Don't move," the man said. His hand wasn't shaking, but his eyes were, flicking once toward the stairs, once back to me, like he was checking he had the right house, the right woman. I memorized his face without meaning to, the way fear sharpens everything it touches. Mid-30s, a scar through his left eyebrow, a gray hoodie zipped to the throat despite the warm night. And then something in my chest shifted, sliding past the terror for one strange second, because I had seen that scar before. Not here, not tonight. "You're Tyrell," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Tyrell Boyd." His jaw tightened. The gun didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. "You don't know me?" he said, too fast. "Grady Memorial," I said. 11 months ago. Your son, Marcus, isn't it? He needed surgery on his brain and the insurance company kept stalling. You sat in that hallway for 6 hours because you couldn't afford both the vending machine and the surgery." His arm wavered, just slightly, the barrel dipping an inch. "I covered what the hospital wouldn't," I said. "I asked the foundation office to keep my name out of it. But I was there that morning. I spoke to you before Marcus went into surgery." His eyes searched my face, and then I watched recognition arrive slowly. "The nurse," he whispered. "You were the nurse who kept checking on him." I nodded once. That was me. For a moment, neither of us moved. Somewhere above us, the television kept playing to an empty room, a commentator's voice rising and falling over a game nobody upstairs was watching. Tyrell lowered the gun the rest of the way, his hand dropping to his side like it had grown too heavy to hold up. He looked, for the first time since the door opened, less like a man sent to do something and more like a man who hadn't expected to recognize the person on the other end of it. "You don't understand," he said, shaking his head slowly. "You don't understand what I came here to do." "Then tell me." He looked toward the open door behind him, then back at me, his breathing uneven now, like the weight of the last 60 seconds had only just caught up to his lungs. "Your husband," he said, and stopped. "Say it." "Your husband paid me." His voice cracked on the last word. $40,000, half up front. He needed you gone before sunrise. He said you'd never see tomorrow. The phone was still in my hand. Reginald's voice had gone quiet on the other end, like he'd heard every word and didn't know how to fill the silence that followed. Tyrell stepped backward toward the porch. "I can't stay here," he said. "If Charles realizes I didn't do it, he'll come looking for me before morning. I need to disappear before he figures out what happened." He hesitated one last time, the guilt plain on his face. "I'm sorry." Then he turned and disappeared into the darkness. I looked at the empty doorway, the same doorway where a man had come to end my life and instead left me with the truth. In that instant, I understood that the marriage I had been quietly mourning for 2 years was no longer the worst thing happening inside my house. Tyrell was gone before I could ask him anything else, slipping out into the dark the same way he'd come. And I stood in my own doorway for a long minute before I remembered the phone was still pressed against my ear. "Brenda." Reginald's voice was tight, urgent. "Brenda, are you there? Talk to me." "I'm here." My voice didn't sound like mine. "He's gone. The man, he's gone." "I heard everything," Reginald said. "Every word. Don't go back inside that house tonight. Pack a bag and come to me in the morning. I'm flying back from Lauderdale tonight." I didn't sleep. I sat in my car in the driveway for 3 hours with the doors locked, watching the upstairs window where the television finally went dark sometime past midnight. And I never once let myself wonder where Charles really was, because I already knew. By 8 the next morning, I was sitting across from my uncle's kitchen table in his home on the north side of Atlanta. My hands wrapped around a cup of coffee I hadn't touched, and I told him everything. The call, the footsteps, the gun, the scar over Tyrell's eyebrow that I remembered from a hospital hallway 11 months ago. The number, $40,000, sitting in the air between us like something neither of us wanted to pick up. Reginald didn't interrupt me once. He just listened, his jaw working slightly, his eyes never leaving my face. And when I finished, he didn't ask me if I was sure or if I'd misunderstood, or if there was some other explanation that made more sense than the one sitting right in front of us. "I believe you," he said. "Every word of it." Something in my chest loosened that hadn't loosened in 2 years, not since before the silence in my marriage had started feeling normal. I hadn't realized how much I'd needed someone to simply believe me without first making me prove it. "I want to call the police," I said, though even as I said it, my voice carried more question than certainty. "And tell them what?" Reginald leaned back. "That a man broke in, pointed a gun at you, then walked out and confessed who paid him, with no recording, no name on paper, nothing but your word against a husband everyone in this family has had dinner with?" He wasn't wrong, and the truth of that sat heavy in my stomach. "Charles thinks that man did what he was paid to do," Reginald said, "or he thinks you're too frightened to do anything about it. Either way, right now, he doesn't know what you know. That's the only advantage you have. Don't throw it away by moving too fast." I sat with that, turning the coffee cup slowly between my hands, feeling something shift inside me. Not fear, easing exactly, but reshaping itself into something with edges. Something I could hold on to. "So, what do I do?" Reginald was quiet for a moment, studying me the way he used to when I was a girl, and he was deciding how much of the truth I could carry. "There's something I need to show you," he said finally. "About your mother's trust. Something Patricia never told you, and something I'm not sure Charles even fully understands himself." He stood, walked to a drawer across the kitchen, and pulled out a folder thick enough that I felt my stomach tighten just looking at it. "Brenda," he said, sitting back down, sliding it toward me, but not yet opening it. "I don't think this was only ever about your marriage." Charles came home from his business trip 4 days later, and I welcomed him at the door with a plate of food and a kiss on the cheek, and not one piece of me let him see what I now knew. A week had passed since the night a stranger stood in my doorway with a gun, and in that week I had learned how to fold my face into something steady, something a husband wouldn't think twice about. I'd learned it the way I once learned to keep my hands calm while a patient's monitor screamed beside me, "Panic helps no one, least of all yourself." "You're quiet tonight," Charles said, settling into his chair at the table, not even looking up from his plate. "Just tired," I said. "Long week at the hospital." He nodded, satisfied with that, the way he was always satisfied with the smallest, easiest answer. That used to comfort me once. Now it told me something different. That he wasn't looking closely, because he believed he didn't need to. We ate in the kind of silence that had become ordinary between us long before any of this started, and I almost let myself sink into it, until he set his fork down and said, without any particular weight in his voice, "We should talk about the trust review coming up next month. The 14th, right?" My hand stilled around my glass. The 14th was correct. It was the exact date Reginald had shown me 2 days earlier, sitting at his kitchen table. The date buried inside paperwork I hadn't even known existed until that folder slid across the table toward me. I had told no one that date. Not Charles. Not anyone. "How do you know that date?" I asked, keeping my tone light, curious instead of alarmed, the way I might ask about traffic or weather. Charles shrugged, reaching for his glass. "I don't know. I thought you mentioned it." I hadn't. I was certain of that the way I was certain of my own name. "Reginald probably brought it up when he called the other night," I said, the lie sliding out smoother than I expected, my voice not catching once. "He's been helping me sort through some of Mama's old paperwork?" "Maybe that's it," Charles said, already losing interest, already reaching for the remote across the table. I smiled and finished my plate and asked him about the cruise, listened to him describe deck views and dinner menus with no mention of who he'd shared any of it with. And the whole time, my mind was somewhere else entirely, turning that one detail over and over like a stone, with a sharp edge hidden somewhere inside it. Reginald hadn't called that night. There had been no conversation between them about Mama's trust. No reason for that date to have ever crossed Charles's path unless someone besides Reginald had told him. Which meant Charles already knew something about that trust before any of us sat down with a folder. Which meant he hadn't simply heard a date in passing. He'd been told it by someone close enough to know it mattered. I carried our plates to the sink and stood there a moment longer than necessary, the water running over my hands, my heart steady on the outside and racing underneath. My excuse had worked tonight, but excuses only work once, before a man starts noticing the seams in them, and I understood, standing there with my back to him, that I had just bought myself time I didn't yet know how to spend. Charles left for the office Tuesday morning the same way he always did, kissing the air near my cheek instead of my skin, and I waited until his car cleared the end of the street before I let myself move. I wasn't looking for anything specific that morning. I told myself I was just straightening his side of the closet, the way I'd done 100 times before without thinking twice about it. But my hands knew better than my excuses did. I went straight to the gray blazer he rarely wore, the one he kept folded over a hanger in the back. And I checked the inside pocket the way some quiet part of me had been wanting to since the night Tyrell stood in my doorway. My fingers found paper before I found anything else. Folded twice, soft at the creases like it had sat there a while, forgotten or maybe just never expected to be found. A withdrawal slip. Charles's name on it, an account I didn't recognize, separate from anything we shared. The date stopped my breath before the number did, the day before the attack. I sat down on the edge of the bed slowly, like my legs had decided on their own that I needed to, and I made myself read the amount twice, because some part of me was hoping the first time I'd misread it. $20,000. I thought of Tyrell standing in my doorway, his voice cracking when he told me the truth. 40,000. Half up front. 20 now, 20 later. I hadn't questioned that number that night. I'd been too busy trying to survive the minute I was standing in. Now it sat in my hand on a slip of paper, dated and signed, in my husband's own handwriting. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that, because I expected to, and I didn't. What came instead was quieter than grief, colder than anger, a kind of clarity I hadn't felt since the night this all started. Every soft excuse I had been making for 2 years of distance, 2 years of silence at the dinner table, 2 years of telling myself marriages simply change with time, fell away at once, replaced by something simpler. He hadn't just stopped loving me. He had priced what it would cost to be rid of me, and he had paid the first half without flinching. I photographed the slip with my phone, both sides, then folded it back exactly the way I'd found it and returned it to the same pocket, smoothing the blazer so it hung the way it always had. Whatever came next, Charles could not know yet that I'd found it. Reginald had been right about that much. The only advantage I had left was that my husband still believed I knew nothing. I sat on the edge of our bed for a long moment after, looking at the photograph on my phone, the number staring back at me in his own handwriting. $20,000, paid the day before a stranger walked into my home with a gun. And somewhere out there, the other $20,000 was still sitting unpaid, owed to a man who now knew exactly whose side he was no longer willing to be on. Diane called the house Thursday evening, and I almost didn't answer. But old habits between sisters die slower than anything else does. Just checking on you, she said, her voice bright in a way that didn't quite reach all the way through. How was your week? Fine, I said. How was the cruise? There was the smallest pause before she answered, barely a breath. But I'd spent 44 years learning the rhythms of my sister's voice, and I heard it anyway. It was beautiful, she said. You should have seen the water. I let her talk, asked nothing else, and told her I needed to start dinner, and she said she'd call again soon. I set the phone down and told myself, that was that. An hour later, looking for my charger in the hallway closet where Charles sometimes left his bag, I found his phone wedged in the side pocket, screen still lit, on speaker, a call still running. He must have set it down to grab something and forgotten it was even connected. I could hear Diane's voice coming through tinny and small, the two of them still talking on a line neither had bothered to hang up. I shouldn't have listened. I want to say that, honestly, because some part of me knew, even reaching for that phone, that whatever I heard next would not let me go back to who I'd been an hour before. He's not going to ask twice, Diane. Charles's voice, low, clipped, nothing like the easy tone he used with me at dinner. I'm not saying no, Diane said. I'm saying once this is finalized, my share needs to reflect what I've actually done here. I didn't agree to half of nothing. My hand tightened around the closet door. You'll get what we agreed, Charles said. What you agreed? Diane said. I'm the one who kept her distracted on that call. I'm the one who told her I'd be in Savannah instead of on that boat. You think Reginald wouldn't have caught us both if I hadn't covered for it? The hallway light suddenly felt too bright, too loud against my eyes, and the floor beneath me felt less solid than it had a moment ago. Once the trust clears, Charles said, none of this conversation matters anymore. It matters until it clears, Diane said. I want it in writing this time, not just your word. I don't remember setting the phone back down. I remember my hands were cold, and my chest felt hollowed out in a way grief never quite manages, because grief usually comes with some softness underneath it, some memory of what you're losing. This had none of that. This was simply the floor of my life giving way beneath a second person I had trusted, without ever once questioning her. Diane hadn't lied to protect Charles out of loyalty to a brother-in-law she liked well enough. She had built a cover story. She had timed a phone call to keep me distracted while Charles boarded that ship. She had negotiated her price the same way a contractor negotiates a job, calm and exact, asking for terms in writing. My sister wasn't covering for my husband. My sister had been standing beside him the entire time, waiting for her share of whatever was supposed to be left of me. I didn't sleep beside Charles that Thursday night. I told him my back was acting up and took the guest room, and he didn't ask twice, which told me more about where we'd already drifted than any phone call ever could. Sometime past midnight, I found the box I hadn't opened in years, tucked at the back of the guest closet. Photographs, mostly. The kind that gather dust because looking at them costs something. There we were at 26 and 29. Charles in a borrowed suit that didn't fit him right, laughing at something just out of frame. There we were at our first apartment, the one with the radiator that never worked, wrapped in the same blanket because we couldn't afford to fix it and didn't yet think we needed to. I let myself sit with that for a while. Not because I owed him grief, but because I owed myself the honesty of admitting it had once been real. Somewhere between that radiator and this house, between the man who used to save me the last piece of pie and the man who priced what it would cost to be rid of me, something had genuinely died. I wasn't ready, even now, to pretend it had always been hollow. But grief, I've learned in 20 years of nursing, has a shelf life if you let it. You can sit with it You can honor it, but eventually you have to set it down and pick up whatever's still standing in front of you. And what was standing in front of me wasn't a marriage worth saving. It was a man who'd paid half of $20,000 to make sure I never woke up to find out the other half was missing too. I put the photographs back in the box, closed the lid, and did not cry, because I'd already done my crying somewhere between Tyrell's hesitation and Diane's voice asking for her terms in writing. What replaced it wasn't anger exactly, though anger was still there, banked low like a coal that hadn't gone out. What replaced it was something steadier, clearer. The understanding that whatever I did next could not come from the part of me that was still grieving a man who no longer existed. It had to come from the part of me that had spent 2 decades keeping my hands calm while everything around me fell apart. Because panic helps no one, least of all yourself. I drove to Reginald's the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the trees, and he opened the door already reading something in my face before I said a word. "You look different," he said. "I am different." I sat down across from him at the same table where he'd believed me without hesitation, where he'd slid that folder toward me and told me this was never only about my marriage. "I spent half the night grieving something that's already gone, Reggie. I'm done doing that now." He waited, the way he always did, letting me find my own way to the rest of it. "They've been planning around me like I'm a problem to be managed," I said. "Like I'm a line item they negotiate shares over. I'm done being someone they can plan around." Reginald didn't say anything else right away. He just got up, walked to that same drawer across his kitchen, and came back with the folder he'd promised me a week ago, the one I'd been too consumed with surviving each new discovery to ask about again. "I should have shown you this the first morning," he said, sliding it toward me. "I didn't want to give you too much at once. I think you can handle it now." He opened it to a page marked with a yellow tab, my mother's handwriting nowhere on it, just the cold, formal language of an estate attorney translating Patricia Forsyth's wishes into something legally binding. "Read the 3rd paragraph," he said. I did, twice, before the words fully settled. The trust my mother left behind didn't simply divide what she had between her 2 daughters. It set a condition. My full share wouldn't be distributed until the trust matured 3 years after her passing, now barely a month away. If I divorced before that date, my share would be reduced by more than half, with that portion redistributed under the trust to Diane. "She never told me this," I said, my voice thinner than I meant it to be. "She never told either of you," Reginald said. "The attorney advised her not to. She believed knowing the condition ahead of time might tempt one of you to make decisions based on the money instead of the marriage. The full trust wasn't meant to be distributed until it matured. She built a trap to keep me married. She thought she was building a safeguard against an impulsive divorce," Reginald said carefully. "I don't think she ever imagined someone would see that clause as a reason to keep you married until the date. Or worse, to make sure you never reach the point of choosing for yourself." I sat with that, the full shape of it settling slow and heavy across my chest. Charles had needed me married, not happy, not even present in any real way, just legally married until that date passed. Once my inheritance was distributed, he believed we'd divide our assets in the settlement we'd already discussed, and he'd quietly benefit from money he never would have received if the trust had reduced my share first. He hadn't needed the trust to name him. He only needed our marriage to survive long enough for the money to reach me. But Diane's position was different. "If I divorce," I said slowly, working it through out loud, "my share is reduced, and Diane receives the difference. But if I disappear before the trust matures, then there is no divorce to trigger that reduction. Reginald finished. Your full beneficial share remains intact. And under the trust's succession provisions, if you die before distribution with no surviving parent, your interest passes to your named contingent beneficiary, Diane. He nodded once. The room felt smaller than it had a moment ago. She doesn't just benefit from this, I said. She benefits more than he does. Reginald watched my face the way he had since I'd walked in that morning, already changed. Brenda, he said quietly, I think your sister has more to gain from your death than your husband ever did. I got home from Reginald's a little after noon, my mind still circling everything I'd just learned, and Charles's car was already in the driveway. He was never home before 6. I stood in the doorway a moment longer than I needed to, rearranging my face before I stepped inside, the way I'd practiced all week without ever admitting to myself that's what I was doing. You're back early, I said, setting my purse down, keeping my voice light. Slow day, Charles said, not looking up from his phone. Where were you? Running errands. The lie came easier than I wanted it to. Pharmacy, then the grocery store. He nodded, set his phone face down on the counter, a habit I'd noticed 2 years ago, and stopped questioning somewhere around the time I stopped expecting honesty to be the default between us. Did Reginald call you about the cruise again? He asked. The question landed strange, almost careless in his tone, but I'd spent 20 years reading the difference between a question someone asks because they're curious and a question someone asks because they already suspect the answer. Why would he call about the cruise? I asked, turning toward the refrigerator so my face had somewhere else to be for a second. No reason. Charles shrugged. You two have just been talking a lot lately. I figured maybe he had more to say about it. There it was. Not an accusation. Just a thread, dropped casually to see if I'd flinch pulling it. He's been helping me sort through some of Mama's paperwork, I said. The same explanation I'd used before, hoping its familiarity would make it sound more true than it was. Trust stuff. Nothing about any cruise. Right, Charles said. The trust thing. He said it too smoothly, like a man repeating a phrase he'd already heard from someone else, testing how it sounded coming back at me. I closed the refrigerator door without taking anything out of it, and made myself busy at the counter, my back to him, giving my expression a moment it didn't have to perform for. You've been over at his place a lot, Charles said. That's all I'm saying. He's my uncle, Charles. He's not exactly a stranger. I didn't say he was. His voice stayed even, almost pleasant, which was somehow worse than if he'd raised it. Just making conversation. I turned back around, made myself meet his eyes, made my voice land somewhere between mild irritation and boredom, the tone of a woman who has nothing to hide and is faintly annoyed at being asked twice about nothing. Is there something you want to ask me, Charles? He held my gaze a beat longer than comfortable, then smiled, small and unreadable, and picked his phone back up. No, he said, just curious. He left the kitchen a moment later, and I stood there gripping the edge of the counter, my pulse loud in my own ears, replaying the exact shape of his questions, the careless tone wrapped around something far more deliberate underneath. He wasn't simply curious. He was watching how much I'd say, measuring my answers against something he already half believed. Whatever time I thought I had left to move carefully, I no longer had. Charles was starting to wonder what I knew, and a man who already paid once to silence me would not hesitate long once he was sure. I still had the number Tyrell had pressed into my hand the night he walked away from my front door. He'd scribbled it on the back of an old receipt before disappearing into the dark. If you ever need to reach me, he'd said, use this. Don't save it under my name. I'd tucked it inside my wallet without knowing if I'd ever be brave enough to use it. I called him from Reginald's house, not my own. On a phone Charles had never touched. He almost didn't answer. When he finally did, his voice was guarded, low, like a man checking who else might be listening before he spoke. "You shouldn't be calling me," he said. "I need your help," I said. "I think you need mine too." A long pause stretched between us before he agreed to meet me, not at his place or mine, but at a diner off Cascade Road, the kind of place where nobody looks twice at anybody. He was already sitting in the back booth when I arrived, hood down this time, looking younger and more tired than he had standing in my doorway with a gun. "He hasn't paid the rest," Tyrell said before I'd even sat down fully. 20,000 more, he said, once it was done. "It's been over a week. He won't answer my calls." "Maybe he's being careful," I said. "Maybe." Tyrell shook his head. "Or maybe a man who hires somebody to make a problem disappear doesn't want a loose end walking around expecting payment for a job that didn't finish. I've seen that movie before. I'm not trying to star in it." I understood. Sitting across from him, that fear had done something gratitude alone never could have. It had turned a man who once pointed a gun at me into someone willing to sit across a table and help take the gun's owner down instead. "I need you to say what you told me that night," I said. "On record. Your voice, the amount, his name." Tyrell's jaw tightened. "You understand what you're asking me to do?" "I understand what he's already done to both of us," I said. He sat with that a long moment, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup he hadn't touched, and then he nodded, slow and final, like a man stepping off a ledge he'd been standing on far too long already. "I've already talked to my own lawyer," he said quietly. "He told me if I keep lying, I'm protecting the man who hired me, not myself." That settled the last hesitation in his voice. I recorded it on my phone, his voice steady once he started, naming the date, the amount, the half paid, and the half still owed, naming Charles without hesitation, now that hesitation had stopped serving him. It took less than 4 minutes. It felt like the longest 4 minutes of my life. When it was done, I sat back, my hands finally steady for the first time in days, the recording sitting in my phone like something solid I could finally hold on to. "You should know something," Tyrell said before I could thank him, before I could even fully process what I now had. The way he talks, careless, like nothing's wrong, he still thinks you're sitting at home too scared to do anything. He told Diane as much, the one time I overheard him on a call before he stopped trusting me with anything at all. "He thinks I'm still afraid," I said. "He thinks you don't have it in you," Tyrell said. "I'd let him keep thinking that, for as long as you can stand it. A man like that gets careless when he believes he's already won." My attorney's office sat on the 9th floor of a building downtown, and I told Charles I had a follow-up with my doctor, another small lie added to a pile that no longer cost me anything to tell. She'd handled my mother's estate paperwork years ago, the kind of woman who listened twice as much as she spoke, and she listened that way now as I laid out everything across her desk. The trust language Reginald had shown me, the withdrawal slip photographed on my phone, the recording of Tyrell's voice naming an amount, a date, a name. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she sat back slowly, exhaled, and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. Not pity. Something closer to respect. "Brenda," she said, "do you understand what you're holding here?" "I think so. You have a documented financial motive, a recorded confession naming your husband, and a trust clause that explains exactly why both your husband and your sister stood to benefit from your death rather than your divorce." She tapped the folder once. "This isn't suspicion anymore. This is a case." Something in my chest sat steadier hearing her say it out loud. The way a diagnosis can feel almost like relief once you've spent long enough not knowing what was wrong. I want to protect what's mine first, I said, before anything else moves. She nodded, already reaching for a legal pad. Then let's start there. We spent the next hour restructuring what little control I still had, moving what funds I could into accounts Charles had no access to, drafting language that would freeze the trust distribution the moment any formal challenge was filed, making certain that whatever happened next, I wouldn't be left standing in the wreckage of a plan I'd had no hand in writing. The trust can be challenged on the marital status condition alone, she said, given what you now know about who manipulated its outcome. But combined with everything else you've brought me, this isn't just a civil matter anymore. I know. There's enough here, she said carefully, to bring in law enforcement today, if that's what you want. I sat with that for a long moment, my hands folded in my lap, steadier than they'd been in 2 weeks. Not yet, I said. She studied me, waiting. My sister told Charles she wanted her share in writing, I said. Not just his word. If she's that careful, there's a document somewhere. Or there will be one soon, and I want it before anyone moves. I don't want this to end with half the truth coming out, and the rest of it disappearing because we acted one step too early. That's a risk, she said. Every day you wait is a day they could discover what you know. I'm aware. Then what do you need from me right now? Help me build the meeting, I said. Something that looks routine enough that they walk into it without suspecting a thing. When I'm ready, I want everyone in the same room when it comes out, not pieces, scattered across separate conversations they can deny afterward. She held my gaze a moment, then nodded slowly. Already writing. One piece, she said. Then we move. Reginald called me 2 days later, his voice carrying a weight I'd learned to recognize by now, the same tone he'd used the night he told me Charles had boarded his ship. I need you to come over, he said. Now, if you can. I drove to his house with my stomach already braced for something, though I couldn't have said exactly what. He met me at the door with a single sheet of paper in his hand, holding it the way you might hold something you didn't want to touch longer than necessary. My ships have a small business center on every deck, he said as I stepped inside. Guests use the printers for boarding documents, contracts, travel papers, whatever they need. After every sailing, my staff clears the printer queue, empties the trays, and collects anything guests leave behind before it's destroyed. He looked down at the paper. One of my supervisors recognized Charles's name on this and brought it straight to me instead of shredding it with the rest. He handed it to me, and I read it standing in his doorway, my eyes moving faster than my mind could keep up with. It was an agreement, informal, handwritten, but unmistakable. A private arrangement between Charles and Diane, dated 3 weeks before the night a stranger stood in my home with a gun. Someone had typed a clean version, then both of them had signed it before printing 2 copies. One copy had gone with them. The second had been forgotten in the printer tray. It laid out, plainly, what Diane would receive once the matter with Brenda was resolved. A number that matched exactly what she'd argued for on that phone call I was never meant to overhear. At the bottom, both their signatures, side by side, like 2 people closing on a piece of property instead of plotting a sister's death. I read it 3 times before the shock fully landed, and even then, it landed differently than I expected. Not as a fresh wound. As a confirmation of something I'd already grieved the night I overheard her voice through Charles's forgotten phone call. She didn't get pulled into this, I said quietly. She wrote terms. She signed them. She did, Reginald said. I sat down at his kitchen table, the same table where he'd believed me without hesitation, where he'd shown me Patricia's trust, where he'd told me my sister stood to gain more than my husband ever did. I thought of every birthday, every holiday, Every quiet conversation I'd had with Diane over the last 2 years, while she carried this folded inside her the entire time. "I'm done being surprised by her," I said finally. I think I used up everything I had left to feel about Diane the night I heard her voice on that phone. Reginald sat across from me, watching me carefully. "I've already had my security office preserve the printer logs and camera footage from the business center," he said. "If law enforcement asks where this came from, there'll be a record." That settled the last question I hadn't even known I was asking. "What do you want to do with this?" he said. I looked at the signatures again, at how casually two names could sit side by side on a piece of paper deciding the value of my life. "I don't want to confront them separately," I said. "If I go to Diane alone, she calls Charles the moment I leave. If I go to Charles alone, he'll find a way to make this look like confusion, grief, anything but what it is. I want them both in the same room, with no warning, when everything comes out at once." "The trust review," Reginald said slowly. "The trust review," I said. "They'll walk in thinking it's paperwork. I want them to find out together, in the same breath, that I already know everything they did separately and everything they did as one." I told Charles the meeting was routine, a formality the attorney needed before we moved forward with the separation I'd finally said out loud the week before, watching his face carefully when I said it, and finding nothing there but quiet relief. "It's just paperwork," I said the morning of, fastening an earring in front of the mirror while he knotted his tie behind me. "She wants everyone present, so there's no confusion later about who agreed to what." "Makes sense," Charles said. And I watched him in the mirror's reflection, the ease in his shoulders, a man walking toward a room he believed held nothing but signatures and silence. I called Diane myself, my voice light, almost warm, telling her the same thing. Routine, formality, everyone present to keep things clean. She agreed without hesitation. No pause this time, no false note in her voice that I could catch, and I understood that she'd grown comfortable believing she'd never have to be careful again. We drove separately. I arrived first, sat across from my attorney in the small conference room, on the 9th floor, and she studied my face the way she had the day I first laid everything across her desk. "You're sure?" she said quietly. "You want it done exactly this way?" "I'm sure." Charles arrived next, loosening his tie as he sat, glancing once at his phone before setting it face down on the table. The same small habit I'd stopped questioning years ago and now understood completely. Diane came in last, a few minutes behind, apologizing for traffic, settling into the chair beside him with an ease that made my stomach tighten even though I'd known, walking in, exactly what I would feel seeing them sit that close together. "Thank you both for coming," my attorney said, opening a folder in front of her, her tone perfectly even, perfectly unremarkable, the voice of a woman about to walk through routine paperwork. "I know everyone's time is valuable, so I'll try to keep this efficient." Charles nodded, already half reaching for his phone again. Diane crossed her legs, glancing toward me once with an expression so casually warm it almost made me doubt, for half a second, everything I now knew to be true. I sat very still, my hands folded in my lap exactly the way I'd practiced the night before, my breathing even, my face arranged into the same calm I'd worn through every dinner, every phone call, every quiet lie of the last 2 weeks. Inside, my heart was moving fast enough that I could feel it in my throat, but nothing on the outside of me showed it. My attorney closed the folder she'd just opened, set both hands flat on the table, and looked between the three of us slowly, deliberately, the way a surgeon looks at a chart one final time before the first incision. "Before we go further," she said, "there's something everyone in this room needs to hear." Charles looked up from his phone for the first time since sitting down. Diane uncrossed her legs slowly, her smile still in place, but no longer reaching her eyes. "What is this?" Charles asked, his voice carrying the first thin edge of unease. My attorney didn't answer him directly. She looked at me instead, a small nod, the same nod she'd given me the day before when we'd rehearsed exactly how this moment would unfold. "3 weeks ago," I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, "a man walked into my home with a gun while you were on a cruise with my sister." Diane's face went still. Charles set his phone down slowly, like the weight of it had suddenly changed. "He recognized me," I continued. "I'd paid for his son's surgery a year ago, and he couldn't go through with it. He told me everything before he left, including who paid him and how much." "Brenda, I don't know what—" "Don't," I said, and something in my voice made him stop. I placed my phone on the table, screen up, and pressed play. Tyrell's voice filled the small room, steady and clear, naming the date, the amount, Charles's name, the half paid up front and the half still owed. Charles's face drained of color in real time, watching his own crime narrated back to him by the man he'd hired to commit it. "That's not," he started. I slid the photograph of the withdrawal slip across the table next, his handwriting plain and undeniable, the date sitting beside the recording like two pieces of the same lock finally turning together. 20,000 from an account I wasn't supposed to know existed, I said, dated the day before he came to my door. Diane's hand had gone very still in her lap. She wasn't looking at Charles anymore. She was looking at me, something calculating already moving behind her eyes, searching for an exit that didn't exist. "And this," I said, sliding the last paper across the table, "is the signed agreement the printer on my uncle's ship left behind, along with printer logs showing exactly where it came from. This is the part I think hurt the most. Not the money. Not even the man with the gun. This." Diane's signature sat beside Charles's, plain and unmistakable, the terms of her own sister's death negotiated in black ink beneath Charles's own signature. "You wrote terms, Diane," I said, my voice finally breaking just slightly, the only crack I allowed myself in the entire meeting. "You wanted it in writing. You got it." Charles looked between the 3 documents on the table, his composure cracking apart piece by piece, the easy confidence I'd watched him carry into this room 20 minutes earlier, completely gone. "You set this up," he said, slowly, understanding, arriving far too late to do him any good. "The separation, the paperwork. This was never about that." "No," I said quietly. "It never was." My attorney closed her folder and looked at both of them with an expression that offered nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, simply the calm finality of a woman who had already contacted law enforcement before this meeting began and arranged for detectives to respond once the evidence had been presented. Charles's eyes moved toward the door, then back to me, and for the first time in 2 years of marriage, I watched real fear settle into his face instead of mine. The detective came up after my attorney finished speaking, not to arrest anyone on the spot, but to identify himself and ask Charles and Diane to remain where they were while officers secured the evidence we'd just laid out on the conference table. By the end of that afternoon, formal statements had been taken from everyone in the room, including me, my attorney, and Reginald. Tyrell's recorded statement, the withdrawal slip, the signed agreement, and the printer records from Reginald's cruise line all became part of the investigation. Charles didn't say anything to me as detectives escorted him and Diane out separately for questioning. Diane tried once, my name catching in her throat before my attorney's hand on my shoulder steered me gently the other direction. And I let myself be steered, because I'd already heard everything I needed to hear from my sister. The weeks that followed moved slower than the 2 that came before them, the way recovery always does after the adrenaline of a fight finally has somewhere to land. Search warrants were executed, Bank records were subpoenaed. Tyrell gave a formal statement with his attorney present, repeating everything he'd already told me. When the investigation was complete, Charles was charged with conspiracy and criminal solicitation. Diane was charged alongside him, the agreement she'd signed, the recorded conversations, and the financial evidence doing far more damage than anything I could have said in a courtroom. The trust went before a judge within the month. My attorney argued what we'd already built a case for, that the marital status condition my mother had written with good intentions had been manipulated by the very people it was meant to protect against. The judge agreed. The contingency clause was struck. What remained of Patricia's trust came to me whole, unconditioned, no longer tethered to a marriage that had stopped being a marriage long before any of this began. I didn't celebrate when the ruling came down. I sat in Reginald's car afterward in the parking lot of the courthouse and let myself feel something quieter than victory, something closer to the relief of finally setting down a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying with both arms for 2 years. "You did that," Reginald said, glancing over at me. "Every piece of it. I just opened a drawer." "You believed me first," I said, "before I had a single piece of proof. That mattered more than you know." I sold the house 2 months later, the one where a stranger once stood in my doorway with a gun, and moved into something smaller, quieter, closer to the hospital where I still went in twice a week, not because I needed the money anymore, but because the work had never been about the money in the first place. Tyrell's son is doing well. I check in sometimes, not out of guilt, but because some debts aren't the kind you settle once and walk away from. He's applying to college next fall. His father received consideration for cooperating early and truthfully, something the prosecutor said weighed heavily in resolving his own case. In the end, what he gave me mattered more to the outcome than what he'd almost taken. I think about my mother sometimes, about the trust she built out of love and fear in equal measure, never imagining the shape that fear might eventually take in someone else's hands. I don't think she'd recognize what her good intentions became. I'd like to believe she'd recognize what I made of it instead. I'm 46 years old, and for the first time in longer than I can clearly remember, nobody is planning anything around me. I'm the one doing the planning now.